23. Black celebrities who tragically died of AIDS that you didn't know about. You might think you know the brightest stars of black excellence, but what if I told you that behind the music, the movies, the championships, and the headlines lies a hidden tragedy? 23 icons celebrated in their prime were taken by a disease many feared to even whisper AIDS. These weren't just celebrities. They were pioneers. Voices of a generation silenced too soon. Their stories were buried under shame, but today we uncover the truth they could never speak. Stay tuned, drop a comment if you're ready to face it, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence. Howard Rollins. Howard Rollins was once hailed as one of the most talented actors of his generation, a man whose career promised greatness both on stage and on screen. Born in Baltimore in 1950, he discovered his passion for acting in local theater before making his way to Hollywood. By the early 1980s, Rollins had become a household name. His riveting performance as C.J. Memphis in A Soldier's Story of Towers secured him an Academy Award nomination, an achievement that placed him among the few black actors recognized by the Academy at that time. Audiences admired his ability to bring dignity, vulnerability, and fire to every character he played. But his most iconic role came in the late 1980s, when he starred as Detective Virgil Tibbs in the hit television series In the Heat of the Night. His portrayal of a principled black detective navigating a racially divided South captured the struggles of real life while offering hope for justice and equality. Millions tuned in weekly, drawn not just to the stories, but to Rollins's commanding presence. Yet behind the fame, a darker reality unfolded. Off-screen, he battled personal demons, including substance abuse and the immense pressure of carrying the expectations of a generation. By the early 1990s, his public appearances had grown fewer. He withdrew into seclusion, living quietly in a Harlem apartment. He began turning down roles, citing exhaustion. But the truth was far more devastating. Rollins had contracted HIV during the mid-1980s, a time when little was known about the virus, and the stigma surrounding it was brutal. As his health declined, opportunistic infections set in, leading to lymphoma that masked the underlying cause, AIDS. His once radiant energy faded, leaving only whispers and speculation in Hollywood. On December 8, 1996, at just 46 years old, Howard Rollins passed away at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital in New York. His mother and sister were at his side keeping vigil as the industry lost one of its brightest lights. To many, the official report of lymphoma became the accepted story, but those close to him knew the weight of the truth. Rollins's passing was not just the end of a career, it was the silencing of a voice that once demanded to be heard. Raymond St. Jacques. Raymond St. Jacques was a pioneer in every sense of the word. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1930, he defied the narrow limitations that Hollywood placed on black actors during his time. While many of his peers were forced into stereotypes, St. Jacques broke barriers with a commanding presence and refined charisma that made audiences see him not just as a black actor, but as a leading man. His most celebrated role came in Cotton Comes to Harlem 1970, where he played the unforgettable detective Coffin Ed Johnson. With a deep, velvety voice and a demeanor that exuded intelligence, he became a symbol of dignity in a business that rarely afforded such respect to African-American performers. St. Jacques' career spanned film, television, and theater. He appeared in series like Rawhide and The Man from UNKLE, further proving his range. What set him apart was not just his versatility, but his scandal-free personal life. Colleagues described him as a gentleman always composed, always respectful, and always striving to elevate the craft. For many younger actors, he represented what was possible if one carried themselves with discipline and grace. Yet even someone so admired could not escape the silence imposed by society when it came to HIV and AIDS. By the late 1980s, St. Jacques began withdrawing from the spotlight. He turned down roles citing fatigue and recurring fevers, but privately he was dealing with the devastating progression of AIDS. Unlike today, when conversations about HIV are far more open in the 1970s and 80s, fear and stigma forced people to live in secrecy. St. Jacques was no exception. He chose solitude over disclosure, keeping his suffering to himself while quietly watching his health deteriorate. On August 27, 1990, at just 60 years old, Raymond St. Jacques was found lifeless in his Los Angeles apartment. A glass of wine sat unfinished on the table, jazz music still playing softly in the background. To the public, his official cause of death was listed as lymphoma. But those close to him knew the truth. AIDS had claimed yet another giant of black artistry. His funeral was solemn, filled with respect, but also with unanswered questions about why such a dignified man had to carry his heaviest burden in silence. Larry Riley. Larry Riley's name may not be instantly familiar today, but in the 1980s, his face and talent lit up both stage and screen. Born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1952, Riley carried within him a love for performance that began with music before blossoming into acting. His breakthrough came on Broadway in the Pulitzer Prize-winning play A Soldier's Play, where he portrayed C.J. Memphis, a role so authentic and emotional that it later transitioned into the film A Soldier's Story, 1984. His performance resonated with audiences, capturing the vulnerability and humanity of a young black soldier struggling with dignity in the face of racism. Television soon opened its doors to him, and Riley found steady success. He became widely known for his role as Frank Williams on the long-running CBS soap opera Knots Landing. His charm, good looks, and natural warmth endeared him to viewers, making him a household presence. Yet behind his brilliant smile, he carried a heavy, unspoken truth. By the late 1980s, Riley had contracted HIV. At a time when even a whisper of the disease could end a career, he hid the diagnosis, telling colleagues and fans that his weight loss and coughing were due to simple bronchitis. His determination to continue performing, even as his body weakened, spoke volumes about his character. During his final appearances on Knots Landing audience. On June 6, 1992, Riley passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was only 39 years old. At his bedside were his wife and young son, who never left him during his final moments. For the public, the news was shocking. The man who had brought so much life to the screen was gone far too soon. His official cause of death was listed as complications from AIDS, a revelation that only came after his passing. Riley's death served as a reminder that even the brightest stars could not escape the silence and stigma of the era. His legacy, though, cut short lives on through his unforgettable performances and the courage he showed in working until the very end. Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey was more than a choreographer. He was a visionary who reshaped modern dance and brought black artistry to the global stage. Born in Rogers, Texas in 1931, Ailey grew up in poverty, raised by a single mother who worked long hours as a cotton picker. Moving to Los Angeles during his teenage years exposed him to new opportunities, including an introduction to dance that would forever alter the course of his life. He studied under Lester Horton, one of the first choreographers in the United States to integrate races within his company. When Horton died suddenly in 1953, Ailey, then only 22 years old, stepped into leadership, beginning his journey as a groundbreaking figure in the dance world. In 1958, he founded the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater in New York City. What started as a small group of dancers quickly grew into one of the most important cultural institutions in America. His masterpiece Revelations premiered in 1960 and remains one of the most performed ballets in the world, a spiritual and deeply emotional exploration of African American heritage. Through movement, Ailey told stories of struggle, resilience, and joy, creating works that transcended race and spoke to universal truths. By the 1970s, he was celebrated internationally, hailed as a genius whose creativity pushed the boundaries of modern dance. Yet behind the brilliance was a private battle. Ailey carried himself with poise and strength, but by the mid-1980s, he began suffering from fever's fatigue and collapsing spells during rehearsals. He explained it away as exhaustion, but the truth was far more painful. He was living with AIDS. In an era when the disease was still cloaked in silence and fear, Ailey chose to keep his diagnosis private, not wanting his legacy reduced to stigma rather than artistry. On December 1st, 1989, ironically, World AIDS Day, Alvin Ailey passed away at Lenox Hill Hospital in New York at just 58 years old. The official cause of death was listed as a blood disorder, but close friends later confirmed the truth: AIDS had taken him. His dancers surrounded his hospital bed in his final days, singing, reminiscing, and ensuring he left this world surrounded by love and gratitude. Max Robinson. Max Robinson was not just a news anchor, he was a trailblazer who changed the face of American television. Born in Richmond, Virginia in 1939, Robinson grew up during an era when segregation was law and opportunities for black journalists were almost non-existent. Yet he defied the odds. After studying at Oberlin College and Virginia Union University, he broke into broadcasting with a determination that could not be ignored. His big break came in 1978, when he was chosen as co-anchor of ABC's World News Tonight, making history as the first black person to anchor a major U.S. network evening newscast. Night after night, millions of viewers tuned in to see him deliver the news with authority, confidence, and a voice that commanded respect. Robinson did more than read headlines, he embodied progress. He proved that a black journalist could not only sit at the anchor desk, but lead the nation through its most important stories. His success inspired an entire generation of young reporters of color to believe they too had a place in mainstream media. But behind his powerful presence on screen, Robinson carried a private burden. In 1983, following a serious car accident, he underwent surgery and received a blood transfusion. At the time, donated blood was not screened for HIV. Unbeknownst to him, the transfusion carried the virus that would slowly devastate his body. Over the next 5 years, Robinson's health deteriorated. He battled recurring fevers, chest infections, and crippling fatigue, but insisted to colleagues that he was simply overworked. By the late 1980s, he had withdrawn from public life, making few appearances and offering vague explanations for his absence. On December 20th, 1988, Max Robinson collapsed and was rushed to Howard University Hospital in Washington, D.C. He died the same day at just 49 years old. The official cause of death was pneumonia, but the underlying truth was AIDS. At his bedside were his children and ex-wife, who read aloud from Black history books his final request. His death shocked the media industry, forcing conversations about AIDS at a time when the stigma was profound. Bobby DeBarge. Bobby DeBarge was once hailed as the angelic falsetto of the 1980s, a voice so piercing and pure it defined the sound of an era. Born in Detroit in 1956, he was part of the legendary DeBarge family, whose hits like All This Love and I Like It dominated R&B charts. Bobby's talent as a singer-songwriter and producer set him apart. His voice soared above harmonies, giving the group its signature sound. Fans adored him, critics praised him, and record executives knew they had a star who could rival the greatest vocalists of the decade. But behind the glamour of Motown fame was a life marred by trauma. Bobby and his siblings grew up in a troubled household where abuse and instability left deep scars. By the time success came, Bobby sought escape in drugs. Heroin became his companion, and with it came reckless choices. In Los Angeles, parties of the mid-1980s needles were passed casually between friends. In one of those moments, HIV entered his body, a silent curse that would shadow his final years. Despite his struggles, Bobby kept creating. He produced music for other artists and attempted to relaunch his own career. Yet fans noticed his changing appearance. The once vibrant, handsome performer grew frail, his face marked by illness, his frame alarmingly thin. By 1991, he was diagnosed with full-blown AIDS, though only close family knew the truth. He withdrew from the public eye, isolating himself in a small Michigan apartment, replaying old tracks and scribbling unfinished lyrics that spoke of longing and regret. On August 16, 1995, at just 39 years old, Bobby DeBarge passed away in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Officially, his cause of death was listed as complications from AIDS. His family kept the details private, wanting to shield his legacy, but whispers spread quickly through the music world. To many fans, the revelation was heartbreaking. This gifted young man who had given so much beauty through song had suffered alone. Do you think the music industry in the 1980s did enough to protect and support artists battling addiction and hidden illnesses? Though his life ended tragically, Bobby's falsetto remains timeless. Every time All This Love plays on the radio, listeners are reminded of a man whose voice soared above pain, leaving behind melodies that will never fade. Willie Smith. Willie Smith was not just a designer. He was a cultural force who reshaped the way America thought about fashion. Born in Philadelphia in 1948, Smith grew up sketching clothes as a child and went on to study at the Philadelphia College of Art before transferring to Parsons in New York. By the late 1970s, he had launched his label Willie Wear, a brand that became synonymous with affordable, accessible, and stylish clothing for everyday people. At a time when high fashion was dominated by exclusivity and price, Smith broke the mold by designing garments that could be worn on the streets of Harlem as easily as on the runways of Paris. His collections reflected freedom and individuality. He collaborated with artists, filmmakers, and musicians, blending fashion with culture in ways few had dared to try. By the mid-1980s, Willie Wear, what general? But as his career soared, his health began to falter. In early 1987, after returning from a trip to India, Smith fell gravely ill. He was admitted to Beth Israel Medical Center in New York with pneumonia-like symptoms that baffled doctors. Friends noticed his rapid weight loss, his fatigue, and his sudden withdrawal from the vibrant social circles he once dominated. The truth soon emerged. Willie Smith had contracted HIV likely years earlier during the unrestrained nightlife of the 1970s and 80s. In a time when AIDS was cloaked in stigma and silence, he told very few people of his condition. On April 17, 1987, at just 39 years old, Smith passed away. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, but the fashion world soon learned that AIDS had claimed him. His death sent shockwaves through the industry, which had rarely acknowledged the epidemic publicly. Designers, artists, and fans alike mourned the loss of a visionary who had made fashion democratic and inclusive. If Willie Smith had lived longer, how much more do you think he could have transformed the fashion world? Though his life was brief, his influence endures. His designs remain timeless, and his vision continues to inspire the movement for diversity and accessibility in fashion today. Essex Hemphill. Essex Hemphill was more than a poet. He was a fearless voice who spoke truths that others tried to bury. Born in Chicago in 1957 and raised in Washington, D.C., Hemphill found his calling in words. By his 20s, he was performing spoken-word poetry in clubs, captivating audiences with his sharp wit, political edge, and unflinching honesty. He was unapologetically black, unapologetically gay, and unapologetically bold in addressing racism, homophobia, and the silence surrounding the AIDS epidemic. His work was featured in anthologies, films, and documentaries, making him a central figure in the black arts movement of the 1980s and early 1990s. Collections like Ceremonies Prose and Poetry cemented his reputation as a literary warrior. He challenged America to look directly at the injustices it preferred to ignore. His words gave courage to countless others who felt unseen or erased, especially black gay men who had little representation in mainstream culture. Hemphill was not simply a writer. He was a cultural fighter wielding poetry as both shield and sword. But behind the powerful public persona, Hemphill was facing his own devastating reality. In the late 1980s, after losing friends and lovers to the AIDS epidemic, he too tested positive for HIV. Unlike many who chose silence, Hemphill infused his diagnosis into his art, making his poetry an act of defiance against stigma. Still, the disease took a heavy toll. He grew frail, struggled with recurring infections, and withdrew from public life more frequently. His typewriter, once alive with energy, now carried fragments of unfinished poems scattered across his apartment. On November 4, 1995, Essex Hemphill died in Washington, D.C. at just 38 years old. His passing left a painful void not only in literature, but in activism. He had given voice to those America had tried to erase, and his absence was felt deeply across artistic and activist communities. Even today, his work continues to be studied, celebrated, and quoted as a rallying cry for equality and truth. Do you think artists like Essex Hemphill, who spoke openly about AIDS in their work, helped break down stigma faster than silence ever could? Though his life was brief, his legacy endures. Hemphill's poetry remains a reminder that even in the face of disease and discrimination, words can outlive bodies and ignite revolutions. Marlon Riggs. Marlon Riggs was a revolutionary voice in American cinema, a filmmaker who refused to let silence define his generation. Born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1957, Riggs grew up navigating both the challenges of race and sexuality in a country often hostile to both. After studying at Harvard University and later earning a master's degree in journalism from UC Berkeley, he embraced film as his weapon of choice. Riggs believed cinema could confront America's deepest hypocrisies, and he wielded the camera with unflinching courage. His groundbreaking documentary, Tongues Untied, 1989, became a manifesto for Black gay men, blending poetry, personal testimony, and political commentary. It was daring, unapologetic, and controversial, sparking debates nationwide. Some stations even refused to air it, but Riggs stood firm, declaring that truth should never be censored. He later created and color adjustment films that dissected racism in popular culture and television. To his students at UC Berkeley, where he taught journalism, Riggs was not only a mentor but a beacon, an artist who embodied integrity and authenticity. Yet while he gave the world stories about stigma and silence, he was waging his own hidden battle. In 1988, Riggs was diagnosed with HIV. He kept it private, telling very few colleagues, fearing that disclosure could overshadow his work. By the early 1990s, his health deteriorated rapidly. Pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi's sarcoma, hallmarks of the AIDS crisis, left him visibly weakened. Still, Riggs refused to stop working. Even confined to a hospital bed with oxygen tubes, he directed his final masterpiece, Black is Black. Ain't the movie on April 5, 1994. At just 37 years old, Marlon Riggs passed away in Oakland, California. At his side were friends and collaborators who had helped him finish his last film, ensuring his voice would not be silenced by disease. His death was a tremendous loss, not only to cinema, but to every community that needed his truth-telling spirit. If you had the chance to watch Tongues Untied, would you see it as a work of art, a protest, or both? Though his life was brief, Marlon Riggs changed American film forever. His legacy reminds us that art can challenge oppression even when the artist himself is fighting against time. Alan Wiggins. Alan Wiggins was once one of the most electrifying players in Major League Baseball. Born in 1958 in North Carolina, he grew up with a passion for sports and speed. By the early 1980s, his blistering pace and daring style of play earned him a place with the San Diego Padres, where he became a fan favorite. In 1984, Wiggins helped lead the Padres to their first-ever World Series, setting a franchise record with 70 stolen bases. For a brief but brilliant period, he seemed destined to become one of the greatest leadoff hitters in the game. But behind the highlight reels, Wiggins carried personal struggles. The pressures of professional sports and recurring injuries led him down a dangerous path, experimentation with drugs. In the party culture of the 1980s, he used intravenous drugs unaware of the devastating consequences. A single shared needle would alter the course of his life. By the late 1980s, his health began to falter, though few knew why. His once strong, athletic frame grew thinner, and his energy seemed to drain away. His performance declined, and teams grew hesitant to keep him on the roster. He quietly left professional baseball and retreated from public view. Friends recalled how he spent his final months in a modest home, coughing frequently, often too weak to stand for long. By 1991, doctors confirmed what his family feared: Wiggins was battling AIDS. It was a diagnosis few athletes dared speak of at the time, as stigma and fear overshadowed understanding. On January 6, 1991, Alan Wiggins died at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. He was only 32 years old. For fans who remembered his dazzling speed and fearless pace running the news, was heartbreaking. His official cause of death was listed as complications from AIDS, a truth that cast light on the epidemic's silent toll in sports. Alan Wiggins' life is remembered with both admiration and sadness. His talent on the field was undeniable, but his story also serves as a reminder of how quickly brilliance can be extinguished by silent stigma and lack of support. Glenn Burke. Glenn Burke was a name that once carried the promise of greatness in Major League Baseball. Born in Oakland, California in 1952, Burke's athleticism and charisma made him a standout player from the start. By 1976, he was drafted by the Los Angeles Dodgers, and 2 years later, he etched his name into sports history not just for his performance on the field, but for something far more iconic. Burke is widely credited with inventing the high five in 1977, a celebratory gesture that has since become a universal symbol of victory and joy. As an outfielder for the Dodgers and later the Oakland Athletics, Burke showed flashes of brilliance. His speed, defense, and natural flair suggested he had the tools to become a star. But his career was overshadowed by prejudice. Burke was the first major league player to come out as gay, and at a time when homophobia in professional sports was rampant, the consequences were brutal. He faced rejection from teammates, strained relationships with management, and eventually found himself pushed out of the league. By 1980, his baseball career had effectively ended, not because of lack of talent, but because the sport was not ready to embrace difference. Life after baseball was harsh. Burke struggled financially, battled drug addiction, and experienced long periods of homelessness in San Francisco. Yet he remained a beloved figure in parts of the LGBTQ+ community who saw him as a pioneer who lived authentically even at great personal cost. By the early 1990s, his health had collapsed. He had contracted HIV during the height of the epidemic, and the disease progressed rapidly. Friends described visiting him in a small boarding house where he lived in poor conditions, his once strong body ravaged by illness. On May 30th, 1995, Glenn Burke died at Fairmont Hospital in San Leandro, California. He was only 42 years old. His death was quiet, attended mostly by close friends and members of the LGBTQ+ community, not by the baseball world that had once cheered his name. Though his career was short, and his life tragically cut short by AIDS, Burke's legacy lives on every time athletes slap palms in celebration, a reminder of the joyful, groundbreaking spirit of the man who gave the world the high five. Ron Richardson. Ron Richardson was a Broadway star whose booming voice and commanding stage presence left audiences breathless. Born in Philadelphia in 1953, he grew up surrounded by gospel music, a foundation that shaped the richness and depth of his singing. By his 20s, he was already known in theater circles as a powerhouse performer. His breakthrough came in 1985 with the musical Big River, Come Here. As Jim the runaway slave seeking freedom, Richardson delivered a performance so raw and moving that it earned him the Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical. Overnight, he became a symbol of Black excellence on Broadway. His voice was not only soulful, but also versatile, able to convey both strength and tenderness. Critics praised him as one of the brightest talents of his generation, and audiences expected a long, glittering career ahead. Richardson, however, carried a secret that would tragically shorten his life. In the early 1990s, he began experiencing fatigue, recurring fevers, and weight loss. At first, he explained these struggles as stress from demanding rehearsal schedules. But in truth, he had contracted HIV most likely in the 1980s during relationships he was forced to keep hidden. As the disease progressed, he continued to perform, clinging to the stage as if it were his lifeline. Even when weakened by pain and shortness of breath, he poured everything into his roles, refusing to let audiences see him as a victim. Yet by 1994, his health deteriorated so severely that he could no longer work. He entered a hospital in the Bronx where he spent his final months surrounded by family and a few close colleagues. On April 5, 1995, Ron Richardson died at just 43 years old. His death certificate listed complications from AIDS. The theater world mourned deeply the loss of a man who had embodied the spirit of Broadway at its best. His passing was not just the end of a career, but the silencing of a voice that had the power to move entire generations. Kevin Peter Hall. Kevin Peter Hall was a man who stood head and shoulders literally above Hollywood. Born in Pittsburgh in 1955, Hall grew to an astonishing 7 feet 2 inches, a towering figure who seemed destined for basketball. But instead of the court, he found his place in front of the camera, where his size and gentle spirit combined to create some of cinema's most unforgettable creatures. Audiences never saw his face yet. They knew his work. Beneath the monstrous exterior of the Predator in the 1987 sci-fi classic, and under the furry costume of Harry in Harry and the Hendersons, it was Hall who gave those characters humanity, humor, and soul. Hollywood had a long history of casting tall men as menacing figures, but Hall broke the stereotype. He infused warmth into roles that could have been frightening, earning him respect not just as a physical presence, but as an actor with subtlety and skill. He also made guest appearances on television, from Star Trek: The Next Generation to Night Court, showing a versatility often denied to actors of his size. Off-screen, Hall was known as a kind, soft-spoken man who loved his craft and his family. He married actress Elena Reed of 227, and together they dreamed of a future filled with both love and creativity. That future, however, was cut short by tragedy. In 1990, after a car accident, Hall underwent surgery and received a blood transfusion. At the time, the U.S. blood supply was not yet fully screened for HIV, and Hall unknowingly contracted the virus. Over the next year, his health began to deteriorate. What started as fevers and persistent coughing soon escalated into life-threatening infections. Despite his optimism and his wife's support, the illness overwhelmed him. On April 10, 1991, at just 35 years old, Kevin Peter Hall died of AIDS-related complications in Los Angeles. The official announcements avoided the word AIDS, but within Hollywood, whispers revealed the truth. Fans mourned not only the loss of a great actor, but of a gentle soul hidden behind masks and costumes. Do you think audiences today would have embraced Kevin Peter Hall more fully if they had seen his face, not just the creatures he portrayed? Though his life was tragically short, Hall's legacy lives on in every film fan who still shudders at Predator or smiles at Harry. He may have played monsters, but he was remembered as one of Hollywood's kindest giants. Sylvester. Sylvester James Jr., known to the world simply as Sylvester, was the radiant heartbeat of disco, a performer whose glitter, glamour, and unapologetic spirit made him unforgettable. Born in Los Angeles in 1947, he grew up singing in church choirs where his remarkable voice, high, powerful, and soulful, first turned heads. By the 1970s, he had moved to San Francisco, immersing himself in the city's vibrant queer culture. With flamboyant fashion, shimmering makeup, and unmatched charisma, Sylvester embraced an identity that many at the time still feared to live openly. He wasn't just making music, he was making a statement. His breakthrough came with the 1978 hit You Make Me Feel Mighty Real, an anthem that lit up dance floors worldwide. Sylvester wasn't simply singing, he was preaching freedom, sexuality, and joy wrapped in a disco beat. His performances became legendary sequined gowns, soaring vocals, and the kind of stage presence that demanded attention. He was dubbed the Queen of Disco. But for many in the LGBTQ+ community, he was much more a symbol of courage and authenticity at a time when society often tried to silence queer voices. Behind the sparkle, however, lay a painful truth. In 1985, Sylvester was diagnosed with HIV. He continued to perform, hiding the lesions of Kaposi's sarcoma with makeup and scarves, determined not to let illness steal his light. Friends recalled how he would collapse from exhaustion backstage, only to return moments later with energy that electrified the crowd. Even as his body weakened, his voice remained defiant. He chose not to keep his diagnosis secret, instead using his platform to raise awareness about AIDS, when many still whispered the word in fear. On December 16, 1988, at just 41 years old, Sylvester passed away in his San Francisco home. In his will, he directed that all royalties from his music be donated to HIV/AIDS charities, ensuring his fight for awareness continued long after his death. His funeral at Love Center Church brought together thousands who celebrated not only his music, but the fearless life he lived. Though gone too soon, Sylvester's legacy remains mighty real. His music still pulses in clubs, his spirit continues to inspire, and his courage ensures that his glittering light will never fade. Jermaine Stewart. Jermaine Stewart was the kind of performer who lit up a room the moment he stepped into it. Born in Columbus, Ohio in 1957, he grew up in a family where music was a way of life. As a teenager, he moved with his family to Chicago, where he began dancing on the local television show, Soul Train. His charisma caught the eye of producers, and before long he was performing as a backup dancer for stars like Shalimar and the Culture Club. But Jermaine wanted more than the background he dreamed of, the spotlight. In the mid-1980s, that dream came true. With a sleek voice, magnetic stage presence, and undeniable energy, Stewart launched his solo career. In 1986, he released "We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off," a song that became an international anthem. It was bold fun and carried a message of safe intimacy at a time when the AIDS epidemic was dominating headlines. The track soared into the top 10 in both the US and the UK, making Stewart a household name. He followed up with hits like "The Word Is Out" and "Say It Again," securing his place as one of R&B's brightest rising stars. But as the 1990s approached, Stewart's career began to slow. Behind the scenes, he was facing a devastating secret: he had contracted HIV. In an era when many feared even whispering the word, Stewart kept his illness private. Friends noticed his energy slipping, his frequent absences from the studio, and his rapid weight loss. He often explained it away as exhaustion, but the truth was more tragic. By the mid-1990s, Stewart's health had declined sharply. He withdrew to Chicago, living quietly away from the spotlight that had once adored him. On March 17, 1997, at just 39 years old, Jermaine Stewart died of AIDS-related complications. His passing was a shock to fans who remembered him as the vibrant young star who had filled dance floors with joy and positivity. If you had first heard Jermaine Stewart's biggest hit in the 1980s, would you have imagined that its message of restraint and responsibility would later echo with such heartbreaking irony? Though his time was brief, Stewart's legacy lives on through a song that remains iconic. He may be gone, but the beat, the voice, and the message he gave the world still resonate decades later. Fonce Mizell. Alfonso Fonce. Mizell, often simply called Fonce, was one half of the legendary Mizell brothers, a production duo that shaped the sound of Motown and beyond. Born in 1943 in Harlem, New York, he grew up immersed in music, eventually studying at Howard University, where his love for jazz and soul blossomed. Alongside his brother, Larry Fonce became one of the most influential behind-the-scenes figures of the 1970s, helping to define the sound of an era. His genius didn't always stand in the spotlight, but the records he helped craft remain timeless. Fonce worked with some of Motown's greatest names. He contributed to the Jackson 5's breakthrough single "I Want You Back," and went on to co-write several of their early hits, setting the stage for Michael Jackson's meteoric rise. Later, with the Mizell brothers, he produced for jazz icons like Donald Byrd, creating a groundbreaking fusion of jazz funk and R&B. Their work pushed boundaries, blending lush arrangements with grooves that made traditional jazz accessible to new audiences. Within the industry, Fonce was admired not just as a hitmaker, but as a visionary who never stopped innovating. Yet for all the brilliance in the studio, his personal life carried shadows. By the late 1980s, whispers circulated about his declining health. Friends noticed his weight loss, his fatigue, and his increasing absences from projects. In 1989, those closest to him revealed the painful truth: Fonts was battling AIDS. At a time when stigma ran deep, especially in the music industry, he chose to keep his diagnosis private. Instead of public statements, he focused his remaining energy on music, often spending long nights in his home studio, working on ideas he hoped would outlast him. On July 15, 1989, Fonts passed away in Los Angeles. He was just 46 years old. The official cause was listed as a prolonged illness, but the reality was AIDS. His death sent ripples of sorrow through the music world, silencing a creative force who had given so much and still had so much more to offer. Though his life ended tragically, Fonts' legacy lives in every groove of the Jackson 5, every groundbreaking jazz fusion track, and every beat that still makes listeners move decades later. Hank Gathers. Hank Gathers was a name that electrified college basketball in the late 1980s. Born in Philadelphia in 1967, he grew up in a tough neighborhood where basketball became both his escape and his destiny. By the time he reached Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, Gathers had developed into a powerhouse forward, known for his athleticism, strength, and relentless energy on the court. At 6'7", he dominated games with a combination of speed and power that left fans and scouts in awe. In the 1988-89 season, he became only the second player in NCAA history to lead the nation in both scoring and rebounding, a feat that seemed to guarantee him a future in the NBA. Gathers wasn't just a player. He was a phenomenon. Loyola Marymount's fast-paced offense was built around him, and every dunk, rebound, and hustle play made crowds roar. His teammates described him as fearless, with a smile that lit up the locker room and a work ethic that inspired everyone around him. Yet behind his explosive performances, his health was becoming a concern. In December 1989, he collapsed during a game and was later diagnosed with a heart condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Doctors prescribed medication, but the side effects slowed his game, and Gathers, desperate to keep his NBA dreams alive, reportedly reduced his dosage. On March 4, 1990, tragedy struck. Playing in a conference tournament game against Portland, Gathers threw down a thunderous dunk, then suddenly collapsed on the court. The arena fell silent as trainers and doctors rushed to his side. Despite efforts to revive him, Hank Gathers was pronounced dead shortly after at just 23 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. In the aftermath, whispers circulated that Gathers had also quietly tested positive for HIV, though his family disputed such claims. Whether true or not, his untimely death highlighted the vulnerability of young athletes under immense pressure. Willie Hutch. Willie Hutch was one of Motown's unsung geniuses, a man whose pen voice and production skills helped shape the soundtrack of an era. Born in Los Angeles in 1944 and raised in Dallas, Hutch began singing in church before forming his first group, the Ambassadors, while still in high school. By the 1960s, his soulful tenor and knack for songwriting brought him to the attention of record labels. His early solo efforts drew modest attention, but it was his partnership with Motown Records that would cement his legacy. At Motown, Hutch became a trusted songwriter and producer, crafting hits for legends like Marvin Gaye, the Jackson 5, Smokey Robinson, and Diana Ross. He co-wrote I'll Be There, one of the Jackson 5's most enduring classics, and contributed to the soundtracks of iconic blaxploitation films such as The Mack 1973 and Foxy Brown 1974. His ability to blend gritty street realism with smooth soul grooves made him a bridge between Motown's polished pop and the rawer funk of the 1970s. As a solo artist, his albums like Fully Exposed and Color Her Sunshine showed off not only his voice, but his socially conscious songwriting. Despite professional success, Hutch's personal life carried private struggles. By the early 1990s, he was battling recurring illness. Officially, it was reported as pneumonia, but friends whispered of a deeper truth that Hutch had contracted HIV years earlier, possibly during the turbulent nightlife of Los Angeles in the 1970s. As stigma and silence surrounded the disease, he kept his diagnosis private, preferring to spend his final days creating music in his modest Dallas home. Family recalled him strumming his guitar and writing lyrics, masking his pain with melodies until he no longer could. On September 19, 1992, Willie Hutch died in Dallas at just 48 years old. His cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but those who knew him understood AIDS had taken its toll. For the music world, his passing was a quiet tragedy, the loss of a man whose work had influenced so many, but who never truly got the recognition he deserved. Though gone too soon, Hutch's songs endure, carrying his soul into every note and proving that even in silence, his music still speaks volumes. Melvin Franklin. Melvin Franklin was the unmistakable bass voice of the Temptations, the man whose deep, resonant tones anchored one of Motown's greatest groups. Born David Melvin English in Montgomery, Alabama in 1942, he moved to Detroit as a child and grew up surrounded by gospel and rhythm and blues. In the early 1960s, Franklin joined Otis Williams and the group that would become the Temptations. My Gee Ain't Too Proud to Beg Dad. What became timeless with Franklin's booming bass adding depth and character that made the harmonies unforgettable. Nicknamed Blue for his calm demeanor, Franklin was known as the gentle giant of the group. Offstage, he was kind and humorous, often keeping spirits high during the grueling years of touring and recording. On stage, his presence was magnetic. Fans adored his rare solo lines, and his voice became the foundation upon which Motown's signature harmonies were built. For decades, Franklin's steady influence helped the Temptations weather lineup changes and personal conflicts. But behind the music, his health was deteriorating. By the late 1980s, Franklin began experiencing severe pain, unexplained fevers, and rapid weight loss. He publicly cited high blood pressure and arthritis, but privately, he was battling HIV. Like many of his contemporaries, Franklin lived during a time when the disease carried immense stigma, especially for public figures. Choosing silence, he continued to perform when possible, even as the illness robbed him of strength. In February 1995, Franklin suffered a series of seizures and fell into a coma. On February 23rd, at just 52 years old, he passed away at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Officially, his death was attributed to complications from a stroke, but close friends later revealed that AIDS had been the underlying cause. The loss shook the Motown family. For decades, Franklin's voice had been a pillar of American music, and suddenly it was silenced. Orish Grinstead. Orish Grinstead was the star who never fully got the chance to shine. Yet her presence helped shape one of the most beloved girl groups of the 1990s. Born in Las Vegas in 1981, she grew up alongside her twin sisters Irish and Lamisha. Together with their friend Camila Williams, they formed the R&B group 702, named after their hometown's area code. With their honey-sweet harmonies and youthful energy, the group quickly gained attention, opening for acts like Subway, before breaking through with their debut album in the mid-1990s. Orish, though quieter than her sisters, was considered the heart of the group, bringing both talent and spirit to their early success. The group went on to release hits like Stilo Where My Girls, at G songs that became staples of 90s R&B. But even as 702's star was rising, Orish began to fade from the spotlight. Health issues forced her to step away from touring and recording, a decision that puzzled fans at the time. She told friends and family that she was simply exhausted or dealing with anemia, but the truth was far more devastating. Orish had contracted HIV possibly years earlier from a blood transfusion she received after an accident as a young teenager. As the 2000s began, Orish's health worsened. She suffered from unexplained bruising, relentless fatigue, and dramatic weight loss. Friends recalled how she still dreamed of returning to the stage, scribbling lyrics in her journal and replaying old 702 songs, clinging to the life she loved. But the illness progressed quickly, and by 2008, she was in critical condition. On April 20th, 2008, Orish Grinstead died in a Las Vegas hospital at only 27 years old. The official cause was listed as kidney failure, but those close to her revealed AIDS-related complications were the true reason. Her passing was a shock to fans who had grown up with 702's music. For her sisters and bandmates, it was a heartbreaking reminder of how fragile life can be, even for someone so young and full of promise. Though her life was short, Orish's legacy lives on in the music of 702. Every time their songs are played, her voice and spirit are remembered, a reminder of the star who never got to shine her brightest. Eazy-E. Eazy-E, born Eric Lynn Wright in Compton, California in 1964, was more than a rapper. He was the architect of gangsta rap. Growing up in the tough streets of Compton, Wright began hustling as a teenager before realizing that music could provide both a voice for his community and a new path forward. In 1987, he founded Ruthless Records, and along with Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, MC Ren, and DJ Yella, formed NWA. Their 1988 album, Straight Outta Compton, shook the foundations of American music, offering raw, unapologetic depictions of life in the inner city. Eazy-E's distinctive high-pitched delivery made him instantly recognizable, while his business acumen turned Ruthless into a powerhouse label. By the early 1990s, Eazy-E was known as the godfather of gangsta rap. His influence was immense. He helped launch the careers of not only NWA members, but also artists like Bone Thugs and Harmony. Behind the bravado, however, his personal life was reckless. Multiple relationships, unprotected encounters, and the chaotic lifestyle of fame left him vulnerable. In early 1995, Eazy-E was hospitalized with what he thought was asthma or pneumonia. Doctors quickly revealed the truth: he had advanced AIDS. The announcement stunned the hip-hop world. On March 16, 1995, he released a public statement confirming his diagnosis. For many fans, it was the first time they heard one of their idols speak openly about AIDS, and his words carried weight in communities where conversations about the disease were often silenced. His condition worsened rapidly, and within weeks, he was bedridden. Surrounded by family, friends, and fellow artists, he tried to make peace with his past. On March 26, 1995, Eazy-E died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. He was just 30 years old. His death sent shockwaves through music, forcing hip-hop to confront the realities of AIDS in a way it never had before. The man who gave a voice to Compton had been silenced, not by rivals or critics, but by a disease that carried devastating stigma. Though his life ended tragically, Eazy-E's legacy remains massive. His records, his label, and his fearless storytelling continue to echo, reminding us of both his genius and the cost of a life cut short. David Peaston. David Peaston was a voice that could lift souls and bring an audience to tears within seconds. Born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1957, he was raised in a deeply musical family. His mother, Martha Bass, was a celebrated gospel singer, and his sister, Fontella Bass, gave the world the timeless hit, Rescue Me. Surrounded by gospel choirs and church harmonies, Peaston's gift was evident from an early age. Though he began as a schoolteacher, music kept calling him back, and by the late 1980s, he was ready to step into the spotlight. His breakthrough came in 1988 on Showtime at the Apollo, where his powerful voice stunned the notoriously tough crowd. Soon after, he signed a record deal and released his debut album, Enter. Two Wrongs Don't Make a Right and Can I, he became one of R&B's most promising rising stars. In 1990, he even won the Soul Train Music Award for Best R&B Soul or Rap New Artist. His performances were passionate, filled with the conviction of his gospel roots and the polish of R&B. But just as his career was gaining momentum, Peaston's health began to fail. In the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with HIV, a revelation that changed his life forever. At a time when the stigma around AIDS was crushing, Peaston chose privacy, rarely speaking publicly about his illness. Instead, he continued to sing when he could, though his once strong frame began to wither. By the late 2000s, complications from diabetes and AIDS had forced him to use prosthetic legs, yet his spirit remained unbroken. He often returned to gospel singing in churches where his voice, though weathered, still carried divine power. On February 1, 2012, at just 54 years old, David Peaston passed away at his mother's home in St. Louis. Official reports listed complications from diabetes, but friends and insiders knew that AIDS had long been part of his struggle. His death robbed the world of a voice that had only begun to reveal its full range. If you had discovered David Peaston through Showtime at the Apollo, would you have guessed that behind that triumphant voice was a man fighting battles most never saw, though gone too soon? Peaston's recordings still testify to his extraordinary gift. Each note he sang was a reminder that even in suffering, beauty can endure, and through music, his spirit still lives. Their stories remind us that behind fame and fortune, there are silent battles too often erased from history. 23 black celebrities, each gifted and groundbreaking, were lost to a disease shrouded in stigma. Their voices, though silenced, still echo in the music, films, and legacies they left behind. But we must ask ourselves, did society's prejudice cost them more than the illness itself? Were they victims of AIDS or of silence and shame? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with Legends of Black Excellence for more untold truths that challenge how we remember.